Hi, this is Don Forsyth. Speaking of groups and group processes, the topic in this segment is power. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell suggested, power is a fundamental concept for the social sciences, perhaps as fundamental as the concept of energy is within physics. We've already spoken of social influence in previous segments, for example, the influence of one member on another member, or the influence of the majority of the group members on a minority of the members. But in some cases, some group level processes require more of an explanation. The chapter's analysis uses as its case the very tragic example of Jim Jones, a powerful leader of a group, the People's Temple, which he moved from the United States to Guyana, and they formed a settlement there. But in time, his power grew so great that the members could no longer refuse his orders. And so when he demanded that they provide the ultimate sacrifice, their lives, they complied with his requests. Such an extraordinary episode in groups requires a perhaps extraordinary explanation. So we'll talk about various aspects of power in this presentation. We'll begin with Milgram Study of obedience to authority, and then we'll talk about the sources of power within groups, and we'll deal to some extent with power arising from hierarchies which tend to exist in the group, because in many cases some individuals have more power within the group than others, and powerful individuals have the right to require those who are less powerful obey their orders. We'll also turn finally to the question of the metamorphic effects of power, for, as Lord Acton suggested, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But we'll begin with the Milgram Study. We probably don't need to spend too much time on that, since most people are very familiar with this classic experiment in which the social psychologist Stanley Milgram created a situation where participants believed that they were delivering painful electric shocks to another person at the orders of an authority. In fact, no shocks were delivered, but the respondents thought painful shocks were being delivered.
In Stanley Milgram's disturbing experiment in obedience, volunteer subjects were told they were participating in an experiment on learning. Each subject was asked to play the role of teacher and to punish a so-called learner by giving him an electric shock every time he gave an incorrect answer. The teacher was told to increase the voltage with each wrong response. The shock generator consisted of clearly marked switches ranging from mild to dangerous to lethal doses. Unknown to the subjects, however, the learner was actually an actor and the shock generator a prop.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 75 volts. Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there. Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
The teachers were told that the shocks weren't dangerous, yet they could hear the learner screaming and pleading to be let go.
The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me
Dance.
out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
At the time, 40 experts predicted that none of the subjects would go over the 150 volts, and only 1 in 1,000 would use the highest voltage. What would you predict the subjects would do?
The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me out.
fast.
Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Let
Bird,
me out.
car, train, plane. Next one, brave. Woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Although nearly all of the subjects objected, a full 65% of them obeyed to the end, administering 450-volt shocks to the learner, even after he fell deathly silent. Milgram was later asked how many subjects ever got up to check on the learner without first checking with the experimenter. Milgram replied, "Not one, not ever."
Milgram's findings surprised many people, including Milgram. When he first began his study, the only cue to the distress being experienced by the learner was a pounding on the wall, which participants could hear at the 300-volt level. He found complete obedience up to that point, but then a declining obedience till about 65%. So he added additional cues to the suffering of the respondent, such as voice feedback, the screams you heard on that brief video clip, at various points along the way, till eventually the respondent said, "I absolutely refuse to continue." There was a decline in obedience, but still, many participants, about 2/3, were obedient to the 450-volt level. Again, Milgram was surprised, so he added in the heart comment so that the victim explained during the initial process that he did have a heart condition, and he complained of his heart condition during the study, and yet obedience still remained high. Milgram was able to demonstrate through this experimental method that people are surprisingly obedient to an authority, even an authority that they may not know well or hasn't been selected by them to be their authority, that they didn't even volunteer to be part of. He created a whole series of variations. The baseline condition you just saw depicted in the film with voice feedback, mentioning the heart problem. Because it was conducted at a prestigious university, Milgram was concerned that perhaps respondents were being obedient because they're responding to that prestige level, so he moved it to a small office complex in downtown Bridgeport, Connecticut, and still found that about 50% of the people were obedient. If people were members of a group where they were obedient, others they were particularly obedient, although if they're part of a group where there was others disobeyed, they were less obedient. These numbers all are numbers based on full obedience to 450 volts. Virtually everyone obeyed at the lower levels of voltage, up to say the 300-volt level where they start to decline. As mentioned, there were many variations. This is the group condition where an actual subject would apparently be surrounded by peers. When the peers were obedient, subjects became more obedient. When the subjects refused to obey, then subjects also tended to refuse to obey. There were methodological and ethical challenges issued when Milgram first did his study. The methodological challenges were suggested that perhaps the participants didn't actually believe that this was a real situation, that they saw through the subterfuge and in fact were just cooperating. But Milgram countered that by suggesting that the levels of stress displayed by his participants suggested that they viewed it as a real situation. He does say in his original publication that approximately 10% of the respondents were extremely distressed by the procedure. And it is clear when watching the video, the film that Milgram made of the experiment, that people were not willingly going along with the experimenter's orders. They contested it as much as possible, tried to refuse, and in some cases the discomfort they felt by having to refuse the orders of the authority was extremely great. So great, in fact, that some suggested he never should have done the study. Diana Baumrein, for example, is well known for critiquing in a substantial way Milgram's research. On the other hand, Milgram countered by suggesting that at follow-up, none of his subjects reported any long-term harm. Most reported it was a very useful learning experience because they now understood themselves better and their own response that they might encounter if they should ever encounter a malevolent authority. There have also been replications of his study and replications in other countries as well. Milgram does report that he originally had wanted to do the study in the United States and also in Germany to determine whether or not individuals raised in that country tended to be more obedient than individuals raised in America. But when he first did the study in America and found his high level 65% obedience, he decided there was no reason really to take it to Germany since the obedience of Americans was quite high already. Some people have suggested his findings were because of the time in which he conducted his study. In the 60s, perhaps conformity was higher, trust in authorities was higher then. The study has been replicated over the years, usually not exactly, but most recently by Jerry Berger in California. He modified aspects of the Milgram situation in order for it to be approved by his ethics committee. For example, he eliminated some of the prods so that individuals weren't ordered to continue when they resisted. And he was able to test 70 men and women, and he found in his research that people were, once again, quite obedient.
Years ago, Dr. Stanley Milgram came up with this experiment to test whether people would blindly follow the orders of an authority figure. He found that 2/3 of his subjects were willing to give the most dangerous shock on the machine. We teamed up with Dr. Jerry Berger, a social psychologist at Santa Clara University in California, to see whether people have changed since then.
Wrong. 90 volts.
The typical response is to turn toward the experimenter and, if not say something, at least give a look that says, what should I do?
His findings once again confirm the original Milgram experiment that people are surprisingly willing to obey the orders of an authority. In some respects, Milgram perhaps documented cooperation as much as he documented compliance, obedience to an authority. Many of the respondents in post-experimental interviews spoke of just wanting to do the part that was requested of them. Social psychologists tend to summarize his findings as the power of the situation, but we, of course, would prefer to summarize it as the power of the group. He created a very strong group, a dominating group situation, and a strong leader, and it indicated that individuals would be likely to obey in such a situation. His study does raise the question of, well, what was the source of the researchers, the experimenters' power? Where does power come from? And that will be the topic of our next segment in this presentation. Thank you, as always, for joining me.